Have you ever stopped to consider that the story you were told about the origins of humanity and its great faiths may have been edited? What ancient secrets lie buried in the sands, waiting for the right moment to be revealed? We're talking about the foundation of everything we know. What if we told you that the foundation of the world's greatest religions isn't where you think? What if history proved that the lineage of the ancient Hebrews, those who gave rise to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, wasn't an isolated people, but rather deeply intertwined with the power and wisdom of African civilizations? It's a revelation that could rewrite the books and dismantle centuries of misconceptions. In this episode, we'll delve into the enigma of the Black Hebrews, a thought-provoking journey that explores historical, linguistic, and spiritual evidence, linking these people's ancestry to the majestic Nile Valley to Kemet and Kush. Prepare to question every image you've seen and every story you've heard about the Bible. Before we open this forbidden papyrus, a request from our ancestral guardian. If you enjoy delving into the mysteries of hidden history and lost civilizations, be sure to subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're hearing this ancient revelation from. Your participation helps us shed more light on what has been forgotten. It's time to light the torch of truth. Forget what you know, for the true origin of faith is about to be revealed. The awakening of a mystery. At the edge of history, where time is sand and the river is life, lies the Near East, the crossroads of the ancient world. This tiny patch of land, bathed in legends and mighty rivers like the Nile, was the stage for everything. It was there in that ancient heat that the first great cities rose, defying the sky with their temples and pyramids. We often look at this place and see only conflict and desert, but the truth is that it was here that a colossal encounter of cultures and peoples took place. Think of the Nile Valley, with its magical floods that brought fertility and wisdom, and Mesopotamia with its laws engraved in stone. It was a melting pot of ideas, with people of all colors and accents exchanging more than just goods. The narrative that official history tells us focuses on kingdoms, wars, and grandiose names, but hides the fluidity of these people. The caravans crossed the Sinai like people moving from neighborhood to neighborhood, carrying not only gold and spices, but also beliefs and the secrets of the world's creation. After all, where the land of Canaan met the might of Egypt, there were no insurmountable walls to ancestry. It was in this landscape of giants, between the land we now call Africa and the one we call Asia, that the seed of a new faith would be planted. A story that began with a nomadic family and grew into a people, under the shadow of empires that were already millennia old. But wait a minute. If it all began at this crossroads, and if the Nile Valley was the center of power and wisdom, it's no surprise that the origins of these people, who would be called Hebrews, are more connected to the majesty of the African continent than we imagine. The story they tell is only the surface, and the true mystery lies in what pulsed south of that sacred river, the heart of ancient Africa. We must turn our gaze south, to where the Nile has its source, for it is there that true African majesty resides. I speak of Kemet, ancient Egypt, and Kush, mythical Nubia, two beacons of wisdom that shaped the world before any other. They were civilizations that already mastered writing, architecture, and the cosmos while the rest of the world crawled in darkness. Kemet, with its sky-high pyramids and gigantic temples, was the center of an entire philosophy of life based on the law of Ma'at, order, truth, and justice. Its impact on the region was profound, influencing the art, religion, and even the governance of neighboring peoples. It was from there that the light of knowledge radiated, reaching the Mediterranean and the Near East, and further south lay Kush, a kingdom of black kings and queens that not only rivaled Kemet but often dominated it, ruling as the 25th dynasty. This land, known for its archers and abundant gold, was a vital connection point with sub-Saharan Africa, guarding even more ancient secrets and traditions. It's impossible to tell the story of the people who lived at that crossroads without acknowledging the power of these African empires. They weren't mere neighbors. They were the source, the cultural and spiritual womb from which many of the region's beliefs and customs drew. If you were there, you would see that the influence of the Nile was undeniable in everything that was built. This powerful duality, Kemet and Kush, was the driving force of antiquity, the cradle from which many ideas about divinity, death, and the afterlife emerged. And it is in this landscape of dark, millennia-old kingdoms that the history of the Hebrews begins to take on much deeper, and perhaps darker, contours than we have been taught. The mythological origin of the Hebrews, the history of a people, as we know, almost always begins with a myth, a saga that gives meaning to their existence. For the Hebrews, it all begins with Abraham, the patriarch who heard the call of a single God, leaving behind the opulence of Ur in Mesopotamia and the comfort of Haran. His journey is the starting point, the great initial exodus of a family in search of a promised land. Canaan, the Bible tells us that Abraham was a Semite, and it's important to understand what that meant at the time. Far removed from the racial classifications we know today, being a Semite meant being a descendant of Shem, Noah's son, and referred to a vast group of Near Eastern peoples with very diverse cultures and appearances. The sacred text itself mentions that the patriarch, during his migration, went down to Egypt in search of refuge and food. And that's when we stop and think, in this ebb and flow of peoples, Abraham and his family were inserted in a context where lineages naturally intermingled. Egypt, a predominantly black and mixed-race African civilization, wasn't a distant place. It was a neighboring power to which people retreated when the land dried up. Even Sarai, Abraham's wife, was mistaken for his sister to protect herself from Pharaoh, demonstrating their strong connection. If their lives were lived in this constant dance between Mesopotamia, Canaan, and Egypt, an African nation, how can we completely separate them from the influence and even the lineage of the people of the Nile? The movement was incessant, the intermingling inevitable, and the physical representation of this family quite different from that which the centuries have imposed on us. The origin myth is beautiful and powerful, but when we step into the sand of history and geography, the narrative expands. Abraham's journey was not just geographic, but cultural, and it leads us inexorably closer to the splendor and color of Africa that lay just beyond. What else might lie hidden along this path? Linguistics and the Hamitic root. When we dig into the language, it's as if we're opening an ancient tomb full of secrets in the dust of words. Speech scholars pore over the original biblical names and terms, and what they find suggests a kinship that goes beyond the Hebrew and Aramaic we know. There's an echo, a whisper of consonants and vowels that takes us directly to the so-called Hamitic languages. This linguistic family, which encompasses ancient Egyptian and other languages from the Horn of Africa, reveals startling similarities in the structure and meaning of certain key words. Suddenly, we realize that the root of a god's name or a central spiritual concept may resonate much more strongly with the Nile Valley than with Mesopotamia, calling into question the purity of a purely Semitic origin. Consider, for example, how the Hebrew word for earth relates to the idea of red, a crucial color in Kemet, or how certain rituals described in the Torah seem to have exact parallels with practices from ancient Egypt. Language is a map, and if we follow the oldest trails, they always seem to lead to the golden sands of the African continent, don't they? This interplay of sounds and meanings suggests that during the period of this people's formation, there was an intense cultural exchange, a fusion of dialects and beliefs that left a profound and undeniable mark. It's not just history that's intertwined, but the very way of naming the world and the divine. After all, if the way we speak is the way we think, and if the way we think is linked to African roots, what does this tell us about the original identity of our Hebrew ancestors? The next step on the journey will lead us to understand how these people actually moved, ignoring the borders that separate us today. Migration theory and Genesis. In the ancient world, the notion of rigid borders, passports, and customs as we know them today didn't exist. The migration of peoples, and more importantly of ideas, was as fluid as the waters of the Nile or the desert winds. Africa and Asia embraced at Sinai, and the coming and going of people was constant, creating a breathtaking cultural mosaic. The theory of Genesis, the origin of these people, must be viewed through the lens of this constant flux. Porters, merchants, nomadic herders, and yes, entire clans moved in search of pasture, trade, or refuge, bringing with them their gods, their myths, and their ways of life. There was no single type of people, but a beautiful and continuous blending. It's crucial to understand that the modern idea of race, which attempts to pigeonhole people into separate boxes, is a much later invention. Ancient peoples identified themselves by language, clan, or territory, not by skin color in an exclusionary sense. An Egyptian, a Nubian, and a Canaanite could be neighbors, relatives, or business partners. If Abraham's family migrated from Mesopotamia to Canaan and from there to Egypt, this journey is proof of an inseparable connection with Africa. They were not entering a foreign and isolated continent. They were navigating the beating heart of the civilized world. Therefore, the puzzle of Hebrew origin is assembled not by separation, but by union and exchange, with the great African continent as one of its strongest pillars. But this connection deepened during the most difficult period of their history, the period of slavery. The captivity in Egypt and the formation of identity, the founding myth of the Hebrews, the one that transformed them into a nation, takes place entirely on African soil. I'm talking about the 400 years of captivity in Egypt, a period so crucial that it can't be summarized as a simple story of oppression. There, in the cultural and architectural furnace of Kemet, the identity of this people was forged in fire. Think about it. A small group of clans spent centuries living and working immersed in the religion, politics, and customs of one of the greatest black civilizations in history. It's naive to think they left without Egyptian culture infiltrating every pore of their beliefs and spiritual practices. They lived, ate, and dreamed like the Egyptians for generations upon generations. Many scholars point to striking parallels between the laws, proverbs, and even the religious architecture of Egypt and those that would emerge among the Hebrew people in the desert. It's as if the very structure of the new faith had absorbed elements of the ancient wisdom of the Nile. It was a forced learning experience, yes, but a profound one. The very idea of an exodus, of escaping slavery to freedom, only makes sense because they were in a place of overwhelming power, Egypt. The grandeur of that African nation serves as the backdrop for the epic, and the escape from there becomes symbolically the birth of a new consciousness. If a people's religion is a direct response to the culture from which it originates, then Hebrew belief holds at its core the African matrix of Egypt. And the protagonist of this liberation, Moses, himself has a story full of symbols that seem to have come straight from the Nile papyri. The hidden symbols of Moses, the liberator, is a hero shrouded in mystery that seems to speak the language of ancient Egypt. The scene of him as a baby, being rescued from the waters of the Nile, is not just an event. It is a powerful symbol that finds echoes in much older African myths. The Egyptians had stories of gods and kings being saved by floating baskets, connecting life to sacred water. The name Moses itself, Moshe in Hebrew, may have Egyptian roots, meaning son of or born of, as in Thutmose or Ramesses. This suggests he was named within a Kemetic tradition, not just an isolated Hebrew lineage, reinforcing his ties to the pharaonic court. He was quite literally part of the African elite. And what about the burning bush? That bush that burns without being consumed, from which the voice of God manifests, has a magical aura reminiscent of African spirituality. In many cultures on the continent, fire and nature are manifestations of the sacred, a point of contact between heaven and earth. Even the staff that transforms into a serpent, a sign of divine power, has parallels with Egyptian magic and royal symbolism, where the serpent, Uraeus, was the emblem of the pharaoh's authority and power. Moses, with his staff, confronts the magic of Egypt using Africa's own language and symbolism. These elements don't diminish Moses' story. They enrich it, demonstrating that his journey of faith and power was deeply rooted in African symbolism. To understand liberation, we need to understand the culture that generated it, and it points us to great archaeological revelations that challenge what is taught in books. Challenging archaeological discoveries. Dust of time sometimes lifts and reveals truths that history tried to sweep under the rug. At the archaeological sites of Canaan, where the Hebrew people settled, and in neighboring regions, recent discoveries have forced a rethinking of everything we thought we knew. I'm talking about artifacts and representations that indicate a much more prominent and ancient black or African presence than previously thought. We found stelae and sculptures depicting leaders, traders and warriors, with undeniably African physical features, many of them originating from Kush and other southern regions. This is not just a detail. It is proof that the region was not inhabited by a single, homogeneous-looking group. but rather by a profound mixture. Ancient texts from neighboring nations such as Egypt itself describe the peoples of Canaan and the Levant with terms that encompass considerable ethnic diversity, including connections to Nubia. The original Canaanites before Abraham's arrival were peoples with strong ties to Africa. This material evidence challenges the widespread image of a fair-skinned ancient Near East and reminds us that Africa was everywhere, culturally and physically. Archaeology, without the intention of indoctrinating, shows us that the ancestry of that land is intrinsically African. It is these pieces, unearthed from the sand, that whisper that the people who would become Israel were part of this mosaic of dark and diverse peoples. But the mysteries don't stop at appearances. They enter the heart of religion, into the secrets of the tabernacle, the mysteries of the tabernacle and spirituality. After fleeing into the desert, the new nation needed a home for their God, and so the tabernacle, the sacred tent, was built to house the most mysterious object of all, the Ark of the Covenant. Looking at its description in the Bible, it's impossible not to notice the similarity to the symbolism and religious architecture of ancient Egypt, the land from which they had just left. The tabernacle's structure, divided into an atrium, a holy place, and a holy of holies, echoes the layout of the temples of Kemet, which followed a similar progression from the public to the most sacred. The Ark of the Covenant, the empty throne of God, guarded by two cherubim, winged beings, recalls the sacred Egyptian barges, carried by priests and flanked by winged figures that protected the statues of the deities. More than that, the priest's attire, the use of linen, incense, and the specific colors and materials, such as gold and blue, all have striking parallels with the rituals and priestly attire of Egypt. The Hebrew people were, perhaps unintentionally, using the visual language of Africa to connect with their God. These are not mere coincidences. They are traces of a cultural wisdom that was assimilated and then reinterpreted. The sacred does not arise from nothing. It adapts, transforms, and Kemet's influence is there, woven into the fabric of the first Hebrew mobile temple. This tabernacle was a physical link to ancestral power, but there are other African connections, such as those found in the legendary figures of Kush, which show us that Africa has always been present in the most important stories of the people. Connections with Kush and the Queen of Sheba. We cannot discuss Hebrew history without mentioning sub-Saharan Africa, and the clearest point of contact is the legendary kingdom of Kush, or Nubia and Ethiopia. The Bible presents us with African figures who are central, not merely supporting, such as Zipporah, the wife of Moses, who was described as a Cushite or Ethiopian, meaning Black Zipporah was not a marginal figure. She was the liberator's wife, the woman who saved him at a crucial moment, and her African origins are an undeniable fact of the text. This shows that the father of the Hebrew nation himself married into the Cushite lineage. African ancestry was at the heart of Moses' family, and who hasn't heard of the majestic Queen of Sheba, who traveled from the south, likely from what is now Ethiopia or Yemen, to test King Solomon's wisdom. This story isn't just a tale of love or diplomacy. It's proof that high-level political and cultural interactions existed between Jerusalem and the Black Kingdoms of the south. This queen, who is revered in Ethiopia as the matriarch of her own line of kings, carries within her the seed of African Judaism. She brought wisdom and mystery back home, creating an unbreakable bond between the faith of Israel and the heart of Africa. These African figures, Zipporah and the Queen of Sheba, are the living links that remind us that the connection was not only geographical with Egypt, but also of lineage and power with the deepest Africa. But the greatest African influence, perhaps, resides in the most revolutionary idea of the Hebrew faith, monotheism. The cult of Aton and Proto-Hebrew monotheism. We've reached one of the most fascinating mysteries, the origin of monotheism, the belief in one God, which is the cornerstone of the Hebrew faith. Official history tells us that this revolutionary idea originated with Moses, but there's a bold theory that points to a surprising African source, Pharaoh Akhenaten. This Egyptian pharaoh, who reigned in Kemet long before the Exodus, shocked the world by abolishing the worship of all traditional Egyptian gods, instituting the worship of a single god, Aten, the solar disk, a universal and invisible deity who had created all life. It was history's first radical monotheistic experiment. The coincidence in time and geographic proximity with the period when the Hebrews were in Egypt is simply disturbing. Many scholars, including the renowned Sigmund Freud, have postulated that Moses may have been a follower of Aten, or that the new faith he brought with him was profoundly influenced by this African cult. The idea of a single, invisible and universal God, transcending form and image, powerfully echoes the vision of Aton, who was not represented in human form. It is as if the seed of monotheism had been planted in African soil before blossoming in the desert with the people of Israel. This connection suggests that humanity's most important spiritual revelation was not a complete rupture, but a transformation of a previous African idea. And the legacy of this ancient African lineage lives on in a people who have withstood time and history, the Beta Israel people, and the living legacy. If we want living proof of the African connection, we need only look to the Beta Israel people, the Ethiopian Jews. They are the most poignant and moving evidence that Judaism is not a solely Middle Eastern religion, but that it has a strong ancient presence in the heart of Africa. Their history predates the diaspora, and, according to tradition, dates back to the union between King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, which would give them one of the oldest and purest lineages in Israel. They guarded their traditions and sacred texts for millennia. Isolated from the world, the existence of the Beta Israel, with their unique religious practices and unwavering faith, defies any narrative that attempts to limit Hebrew ancestry to a single ethnic group or region. They are the living memory of a people who emerged at that crossroads of cultures and spread far and wide, including and especially to Africa. When you see the face of Beta Israel, you realize the strength of a legacy that has not been erased by history. It is the face of Africa in Judaism, a powerful reminder that the Bible cannot be read without the Black Continent. They are a testament to the fact that the original Hebrew identity was, indeed, colorful, diverse, and profoundly African, but this fact contradicts the image the Western world has created and disseminated for centuries, doesn't it? The conflict with the Western narrative, it turns out that over the centuries, especially from the Middle Ages onward in Europe, history and art began to erase the African ancestry of the Hebrew people. We've become accustomed to seeing representations of Moses, Abraham, and even Jesus with European features, with fair skin and straight hair. This visual alteration was no accident. It was an act of cultural appropriation, a way to whiten the biblical narrative and align it more closely with the dominant European identity. In doing so, official Western history conveniently erased the undeniable connection between the origins of faith and the wisdom of African civilizations. When a people's ancestors are represented in a way that doesn't reflect historical and geographical reality, part of their truth is stolen. The conflict therefore lies in confronting the idealized image of the West with archaeological discoveries and the evidence of the sacred text itself. It takes a conscious effort to reverse this historical whiteness and reclaim the original color of the biblical narrative, which is the color of the warm land of the Near East and the Nile. The ancient Hebrews were, in fact, a people of diverse colors and features, the product of that cultural crossroads. What this Western narrative has ignored for centuries is that the power and wisdom of African history are far deeper than any erasure can achieve. And worse still, to justify this exclusion, certain biblical texts have been distorted. The symbolism of skin and the curse of Ham, it's sad, but we have to face the fact that centuries later, to justify prejudice and even the enslavement of African peoples, certain biblical passages were perversely distorted. The greatest example of this is the infamous curse of Ham, a text from Genesis that, in the hands of ill-intentioned individuals, became an excuse for racism. In the original narrative, Noah curses Canaan, the son of Ham, not Ham himself, who was the father of the peoples of Kemet and Kush. The curse has nothing to do with skin color, but with a question of territory and power. It's a family drama, not a racial sentence. However, colonial and slave-owning minds took this passage and reinterpreted it, claiming that black skin was the sign of Ham's curse and, therefore, a divine justification for oppression. This is a grave historical and spiritual error that reverses the original meaning of the text. The Bible, in its original context, valued diversity and connection to Africa, but subsequent history used these same texts to justify segregation. Deconstructing this lie is essential to rewriting the true history of African ancestry. By recovering the original context, we realize that the symbolism of skin in antiquity was much more about clan and geographic origin than about hierarchy, and that the history of Israel cannot be told without the descendants of Ham. The secrets of the name Israel. The name Israel, the name that defines an entire nation, holds within itself a secret worth unraveling. According to the Bible, it was given to Jacob after a mysterious struggle with a divine being, and means he who wrestles with God or Prince of God. A powerful name, it conveys the spiritual journey of a people. But let's look at the esoteric and etymological roots of this name, and we might be surprised to find possible African connections. If the influence of Kemet and Kush was so great, could the very sound of Israel have an echo in the Nile Valley? Some scholars suggest that the El, God, at the end of the name, although common in Semitic languages, may have a deeper resonance with Kemet's ideas of universal divinity, or even with more ancient African roots. It's a compelling hypothesis that challenges a single origin. After all, Jacob's wrestling match wasn't just with an angel. It was a journey of spiritual transformation. What if this transformation was inspired by an ancient wisdom that saw the divine everywhere, including in the stars and sacred rivers, just as the African people did? The name Israel is, therefore, an invitation to look at the origins of their faith in a broader and more ancient way, recognizing that African spiritual wisdom was everywhere. And this wisdom manifested itself in powerful rituals. The path of hidden wisdom. The hidden wisdom of African peoples was, and still is, deeply tied to respect for ancestors, to the belief that those who have passed on continue to participate in the lives of the living. This reverence, this connection to lineage, is a spiritual pillar that echoes in many ancient Hebrew practices. Consider the rites of passage and traditions of preserving genealogical history, which are so important in Judaism. This obsession with remembering and honoring your father's father and his father's father is a form of ancestor worship, a practice that resonates with the spirituality of Kemet and Kush. The sacrifices, purifications, and even the way time is counted in the Hebrew calendar all have parallels with African rituals of harmony with nature and the divine. It's not that they were copied, but that they came from the same source of ancestral wisdom. That cultural melting pot, the very emphasis on community and the oral transmission of stories and laws, hallmarks of African cultures, was essential to the survival of the Hebrew faith. Wisdom was not just found in the texts, it was found in the voice of the elder, in the collective memory. It is on this path of hidden wisdom, of interconnected spiritual practices, that we realize that the Abrahamic religions have deep African roots. And the impact of accepting this origin completely transforms our understanding of history. Cultural and religious transformation. The great transformation happens when we finally accept this view, that the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, were not born in a vacuum, but were deeply nourished by African culture and spirituality. This changes everything we thought we knew. If the Hebrew faith has Egypt and Kush at its core, then Christianity, which grew out of Judaism and Islam, which also traces its roots back to Abraham, carry the African legacy in their DNA. The world's three largest religions have an ancestral base on the Black Continent. This revelation is an invitation to unity, a reminder that the history of human faith is one, and that racial divisions are modern constructs that did not exist in Genesis. Reconciling oneself with one's African origins unifies the history of faiths. Judaism becomes more ancient, Christianity more universal, and Islam more connected to the primordial source of humanity. History is no longer about who is chosen, but about who carries the ancient wisdom of us all. It's a transformation that forces us to see the world map differently, recognizing that the cradle of civilization and humanity's most powerful spirituality lies in the heart of Africa. But there's an uncomfortable silence that prevents us from having all the answers. The silence of history and lost documents. In every great story there is a silence, a void of information that leaves us in mystery. In the case of the Black Hebrews, This silence manifests itself in the loss or destruction of documents and records that could have irrefutably confirmed the ancestral African connection. Think of the libraries that were burned, the cities that were buried, and the oral narratives that were lost to the diaspora and time. How many texts, how many Egyptian or Kushite scrolls spoke of the Apiru, the likely precursor to the term Hebrew, and their interactions? This silence in history is not accidental. It is the result of conflicts, shifts in power, and unfortunately a conscious desire to rewrite the past to suit the present. History, as we know, is almost always told by the victors. The lack of conclusive evidence forces us to connect the dots through archaeology, linguistics and mythology. But the search for a sacred text, a lost papyrus that solves everything, continues to haunt us. The mystery remains in the air, an invitation to eternal investigation. But what matters, in the end, is not just what was lost but what we can still rescue, because recognizing this origin brings a profound message of unity for all humanity, the message of ancestral reconciliation, the recognition of the African origins of the Hebrew people and, consequently, of the entire Abrahamic tradition, is not just a historical fact. It is a message of ancestral reconciliation. It is an invitation for humanity to look at its roots in a unified way. After all, if the faith that shaped the West and much of the East has its cultural cradle in the Nile Valley, this forces us to embrace Africa not as a separate continent, but as the spiritual heart of civilization. Divisions fall away when we realize that our myths have the same mother. This unified vision reminds us that we all, on some level, share the same story, the same quest for the divine. There is no superior race or chosen people in an exclusive sense, but rather one human family. It's a profound reflection that takes us out of the box of prejudice and sectarianism, showing that diversity is the essence of creation, and that ancestral wisdom is everyone's heritage. History becomes a bridge, not a wall. The African legacy, which remained hidden for so long, now emerges as the key to healing the wounds of the past, and showing us that the strength and wisdom of Kemet and Kush continue to influence the world. The undeniable influence on the modern world. We have reached the end of this journey, but the story doesn't end here. It launches into the future, challenging everything we've learned. The undeniable influence of the wisdom and strength of African civilizations still pulses at the heart of the world's greatest religions. The legacy of Kemet and Kush is not just in museums. It is in the moral framework, the pursuit of justice, ma'at, and the belief in an afterlife that have become ingrained in the faiths of billions of people. Africa is the foundation, albeit hidden, of much of modern spirituality. Rewriting history, accepting the color and diversity of Hebrew origins, is an act of justice and a recovery of ancestral truth. It means giving Africa its rightful place as the cradle not only of humanity, but also of its most profound ideas about God. This knowledge shouldn't divide us, but inspire us to dig deeper and question what has been hidden from us. The history we know is only the surface, and the true epic lies in the legends and mysteries that emerged from the sands of the Nile. Ancestral African wisdom is the key that unlocks our own understanding of the origins of faith. What else, after all, has official history prevented us from seeing? The invitation to discovery remains powerful and eternal,